Black Myth Wukong has been on my radar for a while, but admittedly, it wasn't super high on my list of games that I needed to play this year. I always intended to check it out, but initially thought it would be a game that I bought a couple months down the road when it went on sale. However, the summer drought for gaming hit me especially hard this year, and considering it feels like it's been months since I played a proper AAA release, I changed my mind and bought the game the second it came out. Maybe not the most financially responsible decision, but hey, no regrets here because this game is pretty damn sweet. A couple of hours in, and it's actually exceeding my expectations quite a bit. So what is Black Myth Wukong? Well, it's something of a Souls-like action game that to my understanding is based on the 16th century Chinese novel Journey to the West. As I've said before, I'm probably not the person you want to come to for story breakdowns, so don't worry, no spoilers or further detail will be given on that front. My understanding of the story thus far is this. You play as a badass monkey warrior with magical powers who is journeying across the land to find some ancient MacGuffins to move the story forward. Good enough for me. There does seem to be some pretty significant lore building at play, including a bombastic opening cutscene that was way more intense than I was expecting, but like most games in the genre, a lot of that stuff is regulated to the background in favor of the gameplay, which fortunately is where this game shines. More on that in a second though. I want to first address what was my biggest concern going into the game, and that's performance. I'm playing this game on PS5, and as you might have heard, reviewers were not sent any PS5 codes for this game prior to release. Every single review out there was for the PC version. This was obviously a slightly ominous sign. Was the PS5 version such a mess in its day one state that the developers wanted to keep it away from reviewers? That was definitely a concern of mine, but considering I'm an impulsive, financially irresponsible person, I bought the game before any reviews were out and dove in anyway. Fortunately, my impulsiveness was not punished in this instance, and I'm pleased to report that so far, I have not had any major performance issues. I'm playing in performance mode, and at least thus far, haven't really experienced any significant frame drops. There are some, to be sure, but for the most part, it feels like my frame rate has been pretty steady in that 50 to 60 FPS range. I have heard that things get worse as you progress, and considering I'm still in the first biome, don't take my experience as gospel, but at least thus far, it seems like worry over the PS5 version being in an unplayable state is unfounded. We'll see if that changes the more I play. Graphics wise, I'm finding the game a bit more disappointing. The world and especially enemy design seem to be very well done and inspired, but at least in performance mode, textures and scenery in general leave a lot to be desired. Everything looks fine in motion while you're playing, but stop to examine the scenery and the world a bit more, and the game starts to look pretty subpar compared to some of the bigger releases of this generation. Textures are blurry, colors are muddy, and the world doesn't look nearly as beautiful as some of the videos I saw from the PC version. I imagine things would look a bit better in graphics mode, but there's no way I'm taking the frame rate hit in a game like this, so for now, this is a trade-off that I'll just have to live with. Also, as a side note, I do highly recommend turning off or at least turning down the motion blur setting. By default, the game has a wildly over-the-top motion blur effect that makes things way too blurry when you're moving, at least for my taste. Once I turned that effect off, I found things to look much better. So the game is not a graphical powerhouse by any means, but it still looks passable for the most part, and more importantly has been running well for me, which is certainly the top requirement in my book. But okay, let's talk about what really matters here, the gameplay. While it does have some shortcomings, so far I am finding the gameplay of Black Myth Wukong to be highly enjoyable. I saw a lot of people referring to this game as a Souls-like prior to release, and while that term has become maybe one of the most overused terms in gaming today, there are a few similarities here. You have the tried and true bonfire system in this game where you rest at designated spots and enemies respawn every time you do. You also have an upgradable flask to replenish your health that is also replenished every time you rest at one of those bonfire spots. And of course, killing enemies grants you souls or XP that you can then use to level up your character and become stronger. I will say though that that's about where the Souls-like aspects end, and the rest of Black Myth Wukong feels like a more traditional action game. For example, you don't lose your XP when you die, and rather than leveling up your character's attributes when you gain a level, the game is more focused on dumping those skill points into a huge variety of skill trees. I've only scratched the surface here, but it looks like your badass monkey warrior is highly customizable with tons of different combat options, stances, gear, and weapons to choose from. But most importantly, the combat just feels freaking awesome. Hits with your staff feel weighty and impactful, and freezing an enemy with one of your magic spells and then just going to town on them never gets old. Your monkey warrior also feels fast and nimble, and controls are just as responsive as you would hope. I'm currently running an armor set that powers up your attack the longer you sprint, and I'm having an absolute blast sprinting around the battlefield and then wailing on enemies with my buffed attacks. I will say that this game also feels quite a bit more forgiving than many Souls games. It's challenging, for sure, but it also seems to be much more relaxed with things like timing windows. For example, I'll be the first to admit that one of my worst habits in Souls games is that I panic dodge. If I'm not sure what an enemy is doing, my first instinct is to just spam the hell out of that dodge button. Maybe I'm still in the shadow of the Erdtree mode, where that shit did not fly at all, but I found that in the first couple of boss fights, you can really put that dodge button to work and come out okay, even if your timing's not great. I do anticipate that forgiveness will begin to fade the further I get into the game though. One other note on gameplay, I have found the actual world exploration to be a bit lacking thus far. At least at this point in the game, the world seems fairly linear, and while there are a few branching paths and secrets you can find, your progress is often impeded by invisible walls and barriers that make the world feel a bit less engrossing than I would like. But again, I'm early on and hoping that things continue to open up the more I play. So all in all, I'm really enjoying my time with Black Myth Wukong. It's a little bit rougher around the edges than I would like, but the moment-to-moment gameplay and combat is so much fun that I find myself often forgetting about these gripes as I play. Black Myth Wukong feels like the first game in a packed fall release schedule, and if this is a sign of what's to come for the rest of 2024, then I think we're in pretty good shape.